We humans, we people, commit atrocities of limitless wickedness against other people in the course of international armed conflicts, civil wars, and persecutions of people by their own governments. These atrocities are sometimes judged criminal by formal courts. In tonight's talk, Martin Elliott, former Gresham Professor of Physics and I, sometimes Gresham Professor of Law, will discuss how an informal People's Tribunal judged mass atrocity killings committed by the People's Republic of China, PRC, of thousands of its people, most notably imprisoned, peaceful, harmless, forbearing practitioners of Falun Gong, cutting open their bodies, sometimes before clinical death, to extract their organs, hearts, kidneys, and so on, for commercial transplantation into other people. And that process is known as forced organ harvesting. All kinds of mass atrocities are accompanied by other grave wrongs committed by people in power in the states involved in the killings of people involved in the states of other states, in other states that have self-interest to serve, people running international organizations such as the UN, and even material for our discussion by international associations of professionals, medics in this instance. And what are these wrongs? Lying about the truth of how and why the mass atrocities were committed, obscuring the truth, declining to face up to the truth. And these grave wrongs, just like the atrocities themselves, are committed by people. People running the criminal governments, people running the other governments, officials of the UN and other bodies. These wrongs themselves do immense harm. First, by freeing those from around the world who should stop the atrocities from doing their duty. Second, by depriving we, people, who claim we would like to see less of such mass atrocities, of learning how and why they happen. Third, by denying all victim people who survive and the bereaved people of those killed of the immense benefit of knowing before the natural ends of their lives how and why their loved ones were killed. Occasionally, we people have been able to mitigate these wrongs by the operation of people's tribunals that do informally what formal courts can never do, so long as governmental and international bodies avoid acknowledging inconvenient truths. People's tribunals have something of a history. The Comfort Women Tribunal, so-called, pronounced in 2000 on the criminality of the Emperor of Japan himself and others for the brutal sexual slavery of women from several nations forced to serve the sexual appetites of Japanese military in World War II. No other body dared to investigate those crimes in any formal way. Lord Russell's tribunal in 1962, the first post-war People's Tribunal in time, assessed the criminality of the USA in the Vietnam War and is the only body to have done that in an evidence-based way, flawed though that tribunal was. A tribunal reported quite recently on the massacre of about 1 million communists in 1965 in Indonesia, but Western powers were heavily implicated in the killings. There has been no official or formal inquiry. And in 2013, the Iran tribunal delivered its judgment about the massacre in the late 1980s by the Iranian Ayatollah regime of its opponents. Well, no one would suggest formally investigating those events, with Iran the catalyst of war it is thought to be. There'll be many other such people's tribunals, all having some and different effects. Now, evidence-based allegations about forced harvesting in the PRC have been public since at least 2002. But investigations in congressional committees in the United States, in parliamentary committees in Australia and elsewhere, have always failed to find, or perhaps have avoided finding, the very facts that were established and that the China Tribunal has been dealing with, findings that show that China has been committing international criminal offenses. And so it was that a non-governmental organization called ETAC, International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, convinced of the truth of these allegations and with much evidence to hand, sought to defeat what it saw as willful agnosticism of people with power around the world, including, it has to be said, several agnostic politicians of the governing party in the United Kingdom. A suggestion to me that a written opinion about the accuracy of the allegations and whether crimes were committed seemed something unlikely to serve any purpose. Whatever the opinion might say, it would get nowhere, not even into a newspaper, and certainly not onto a dusty government shelf. Had the NGO thought about a people's tribunal, I asked. No, and they weren't keen. Why would they put their own certainty at risk by having an independent body, and people's tribunals have to act completely independently? Why would they put their certainty at risk by having such a tribunal maybe pronounce negatively on what they believed? But with time, they could see the possible value despite the risk. I provided a model, and they appointed the panel. The principle was to have non-experts, not even lawyers, although in the event 4 lawyers but not working as lawyers were on the panel of the tribunal. The members read all the written material presented by the NGO, heard witnesses in London in public with proceedings streamed for public view. Witnesses came from around the world in person or by the equivalent of Skype. There was a pause for further evidence, including evidence that the tribunal itself called for, a further evidence hearing, and at the end of that, an interim finding. Later, in June of this year, a 60-page summary of the final judgment was read out at a public hearing. That's the judgment. Sorry, I can't see it on the screen here. The PRC and the few non-Chinese doctors who had spoken in favor of the PRC were repeatedly invited to participate in all hearings, but failed to respond or to help. The full final judgment, which takes a certain amount of time of completion in order to ensure that absolutely everything is accurate as it should be, will be available fairly soon. Now, every word read by the tribunal can be read on the website of the chinatribunal.com, and every witness heard can be seen on video. And if anybody wishes to challenge the findings made by the tribunal, they will need first to review all the evidence and the analysis. Answering difficult questions is a standard activity of people throughout their lives. Being fair in the process is not necessarily difficult. You hear witnesses in person wherever possible. You regard hearsay, secondary evidence, second-hand evidence, if you like, with much greater caution. You treat written material with the same care you would any work of scholarship or piece of investigative journalism, checking for accuracy wherever you can. And we only really needed to borrow one principle from regular legal practices and procedures, namely not to allow experts to address us on the final issues, which were always our reserve, issues for us to deal with. They could help us along the way, but only so far. We recognized that there was a risk because of the terrible human rights record of the PRC that could possibly be prejudicial. So we dealt with the evidence in this way. We looked at self-contained silos of evidence on particular issues. For example, telephone calls made to hospitals in China where offers of liver could come within 2 weeks. Imprisoned Falun Gong practitioners being medically tested in a way consistent with, and only consistent with, checking on the condition of their internal organs that would be available for sale. Statistical evidence showing the capacity within the PRC to perform transplant operations. But we treated those silos of evidence in our discussions as if they related to, say, New Zealand or Canada or some other country that had a good human rights record. We excluded, in a very practical way, the risk of prejudice. That led to a series of separate and necessarily conservative conclusions, which could then be added together to come to the final conclusion, which was that the acts of concern of the NGO, forced organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience, as their mandate is, we came to the conclusion that all those acts had been happening. In addition, that there was mass detention and torture on an immense scale of those people imprisoned without any justification for their imprisonment. And we concluded that these amounted to crimes against humanity. We tribunal members acted as if we were jurors. And like jurors everywhere, we found ourselves assessing factual witnesses, handling expertise, particularly statistical, making conclusions from various strands of evidence. And for a time, we ceased to be part of that near universal cadre of those of us who are forever saying of every distant, anonymous, disappointing body of other people, they won't do this. They won't tell us the truth. They lie to us. And instead, we became a tiny group of people saying, on this, we can reach a judgment. And here it is.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. My name is Martin Elliott. I was professor of physics, and I was a cardiac surgeon and a transplant surgeon. Now, so Geoffrey has explained that people's tribunals are formed of citizens willing to make decisions about important issues which national and international bodies have inadequately addressed. I was asked to join this tribunal as such a citizen. And you might reasonably ask, why did I accept? Well, I did so because the allegations to be investigated were so horrific and so similar in scale to the major horrors of the 20th century that I felt a moral responsibility to become involved. I simply couldn't stand by. I also accepted because of a clear secondary role within the tribunal. Alone amongst the members, I had both detailed technical knowledge and practical experience of organ transplantation. And my job today, in the middle of this description of a tribunal, is to explain some of these organ transplantation issues with which the China Tribunal had to come to terms. Organ transplantation, the ability to transplant an organ from one human being to another, can be considered in many ways a scientific and social triumph. Indeed, it's been used as an indicator of social progress in many societies. Excuse me. Some people have described it as the apotheosis of human generosity, one human being thinking of another and in mental preparation for their own death, having the generosity of spirit to offer one or more of their organs after they subsequently die, potentially to save or at least prolong and improve the life of another to them unknown person. Now, sorry, I have to go with this one. Now, an organ transplant is a surgical operation in which a failing organ is removed from the recipient and replaced with a healthy one from a donor, another individual. And following an improved understanding of immunology and tissue rejection and use of drugs for its suppression, The process has evolved considerably over the last 70 years, and procedures and drug regimens have mean that we can now permit the transplantation of several organs. And you'll mostly be familiar, I think, with the use of the heart, the liver, lungs, kidneys, and cornea. But more recently, we've been able to transplant pancreas, bowel, uterus, even the face. Now, a person, a single donor, as you can imagine, can provide organs for several recipients. For example, heart, lungs, small bowel, kidneys, and so on. And one patient may then benefit several in this altruistic act of donation. But the whole process is absolutely dependent on consent. Consent of the donor in advance, consent of their family at the time of transplantation, and of course, consent of the recipient. Transplantation is built on sound, well-established ethical foundations and considerable trust wherever it's carried out. Organ donation laws differ somewhat from country to country, but largely covered by the concept of opt-in, in which a donor voluntarily signs up to have their name on a donor register, which most of you, I think, will be familiar with, or an opt-out system currently being debated in England, in which everyone is assumed to have given consent for their organs to be removed, unless in advance they opt out of that system. The family still has the right, appropriately, to withdraw their consent at the time of organ donation, because they have to live on afterwards with the decisions that they take. And it can be very emotionally challenging, particularly in the case of children. Organs are normally retrieved from people who are either brain dead or after circulatory death. I'll explain those briefly in a moment. In recent years, donation after circulatory death has become possible because of improvements in organ preservation, and that's resulted in an increase in the number of donors available. You can also donate, as it were, an organ you can spare or tissue you can spare as a live donor. You have heard of this from family donation one to the other, or you can donate parts of a lung, parts of a liver, and so on. But still, the dominant number of donations come from deceased donors. Now, what is meant by brain death? Well, this is the irreversible loss of function of the brain, and particularly the brain stem, which is controlling your breathing, amongst other things. And a patient determined to be brain dead is legally and clinically dead. It is genuinely irrecoverable. Death after circulatory death, it means that someone has died, for example, as arriving in an emergency room, but not yet been declared brain dead, but they've actually died of, say, circulatory failure, and you can, in the current era, treat them. The three characteristics which you must have to be declared brain dead are to be in a coma, to have apnea, which means you have absolutely no breathing and no drive for breathing, that you have to have lost certain things called brain stem reflexes, for example, putting icy water in the ear, which results in a response, which it does not do if you've lost your brain stem reflexes. And you obviously have to be on no drugs, no anesthetic or sedative drugs, which would otherwise confuse you. Of note is that there is currently no legally accepted definition of brain death in China. Now, without consent, organ donation has the potential to become coercive, exploiting the poor, particularly live donors, by trading in organs such as the kidney, as you can see has happened to these people. or by violating the human rights of individuals in the case of executed prisoners, extracting their organs either without consent at all or under conditions of forced consent. And this is contrary to Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, it has been argued that a trade in organs which ensures that the seller of the organ is fully informed of the consequences of donating their kidney, for example, is actually mutually beneficial between consenting adults. The donor lives and is marginally better off, trading a risk to life for a short-term gain. And the practice continues, especially in relatively unregulated markets, as occurs in Egypt, India, and Turkey, amongst others, in the current era. But a donation which unavoidably results in the death of the donor can in no way be considered to be mutually beneficial, and it's unethical and criminal. Now, your body has systems within it to identify and to reject tissues which it regards as non-self. So if that red liver was transferred into the patient on the left, you would try and reject it. There are various proteins on cells and on the organs themselves which can be attacked by circulating factors or by other cells and destroy the function. So if we want to make the transplant successful, excuse me, if we want to make the transplant successful, we need to get as close a tissue typing match as is possible between the donor and the recipients to make that transplant successful. And this is done by conventional blood typing. A AB recipient can receive an organ from AB, A, B, and O donors. An O recipient can only receive them from an O donor. So there are various simple relationships. But in addition, we measure something called the HLA antigen, or major histocompatibility complex, which allows us to get much more sophisticated in terms of defining the tissue types. Now, we obviously don't need to go into the details of that tonight. It's not important. But what is important is that all of these things require blood tests, and which has become, as you heard from Sir Geoffrey, a topic of great significance in evidence presented to the tribunal. Many of the witnesses, many of them, and much of the written evidence reported forcible blood testing and forcible assessment of organ function by, for example, ultrasound during their enforced detention without charge, by the way. Such tests would be necessary to match potential donors to recipients. And whilst you can conceive of other tests that might be possible, this seems to be an unlikely thing to do in prisoners. A transplantation at a national or international level at scale requires a significant infrastructure. And this starts with a database which matches the relevant characteristics of the donor, size, weight, sex, and all of the tissue characteristics as I've described, together with their underlying disease. And the databases are at a minimum national and very often international. UNOS in the United States, Eurotransplant in Europe. The demand for organs far exceeds supply. So you have to prioritize who gets the organs that are donated. People waiting for organs have to wait a long time, and some sadly die on the waiting list before an organ becomes available. When an organ does become available, the organs are usually retrieved from the hospital in which the donor is being managed. When a potential donor is then identified, the database is searched centrally and suitable recipients are identified, after which there's a whole bunch of logistic questions which have to be sorted out. Is there a donor team available to go and retrieve the organs? Is there a recipient surgical team available at the transplant centre? Is an operating room available? Are there beds available in the ICU? Can the recipient get to hospital in time? All of these and many more questions are detailed by protocol and by checklist. The whole process, as you can imagine, requires considerable expertise. It's highly integrated. You have to have surgeons, physicians, nurses, technicians, and trained coordinators to pull the whole thing together. And an effective transport and organ distribution system is necessary. It's teamwork. And teamwork at this stage is absolutely critical. But you need to separate the two teams. The team that is on the recipient side and the team that on the donor side have to be maintained structurally separate to maintain an ethical division between the two, so that the recipient isn't putting pressure on the donor or the donor team in order to get an organ over and above another person. Now, I need to tell you a little bit about organ extraction. This became another important topic for the tribunal to consider. In the current era, in most countries, organs are removed not piecemeal, but in a multi-organ retrieval operation at the donor hospital. Teams of surgeons, often from different centres around the country, will converge on the donor at the donor hospital. And while all is in place, after a plethora of checks, the donor is brought to the operating room and set up as if for a major surgical operation. And we make a big incision in the patient. After which, the heart and whatever great vessels you're exploring for removal have to be exposed. It's quite an extensive exposure. What we do is to cannulate the blood vessels going into the organ, the relevant organ, and cannulate the vessels that are leaving that organ, so that at the right moment in the procedure we can flush those organs with a perfusate, a cold solution, which will both chill them quickly and preserve them. The patient is heparinized in order to do that. Once everything is cannulated, the key step is this one in the middle, which is that the heart team clamps the aorta, which stops any blood flowing out of the heart, and cold solution paralyzes the heart, and then we divide the two draining veins from the heart to allow the fluid to flush through. A lot of fluid goes through, the heart is then cooled down to a very low temperature, 4 to 5 degrees, and the heart is removed and placed into bags and then in ice and transported by the transport system. Once that has happened, the various organs are simultaneously perfused and they can drain through the same veins so that the organ is in good shape for removal and transportation. Why that matters was because one of the topics of concern in the tribunal was the mode by which organs were extracted from deceased bodies. In much of the evidence, warm ischemic time was greatly emphasized by the Chinese hospitals. Now, in a deceased brain-dead donor, it's always a short period of time, the warm ischemic time. It's the time taken that it takes you to flush that organ with cold solution and then reattach it when you get to the base hospital. It's longer in a post-circulatory death donation, but at the moment I just want to concentrate on deceased donation. Cold ischemic time is the journey, essentially, in the box of ice. So you want to keep a short warm ischemic time and a cold and as short as possible cold ischemic time to preserve the organ. Now, as I said, the warm ischemic time should always be short, and it was striking how much evidence was presented that in China this was a sort of marketing point, that we have very warm ischemic times. It is of particular importance if the organs have to be removed quickly from a live patient. And that happened. The tribunal heard evidence. This is Dr. Enver Tohti, who was ordered to remove organs from a live, incompletely executed prisoner in 1995. Person shot in the right chest rather than the back of the head, and ordered to remove the organs quickly, as fast as possible for transplantation. That needs a short, warm ischemic time. Highly trained surgeons, doctors, and nurses are involved in organ transplantation. It's inconceivable to carry out such surgery without awareness of the state of the donor, and it's inconceivable to insert organs without knowing that. It is unethical and indeed criminal to operate without consent, and removal of vital organs is unsurvivable. If the donor is brain dead, clearly that's not an issue, but if the donor is not brain dead or has not given consent, then it's murder. It is forced organ harvesting. And one ought to be able to trace that sort of knowledge around the place based on the data that are collected. There should be an audit trail. I've already said that databases exist to match donor and recipient, and that data are necessary to follow up transplanted patients. It's important to know about tissue matching, any other donor issues such as mismatch of size, infection, malignancy that's discovered in the donor, all of which may affect the fate of the recipient. That's why you need an audit trail. Now, in the UK and most other countries, the anonymized data are available for public scrutiny and for research purposes. Countries publish these data to international registries and as national reports. And in the UK, those reports are available for you to see online at the NHS Blood and Transplant website. In China, it's different. In China, organs came largely from executed prisoners. The data were held as a state secret, both about the number of executions and the number of transplants. Formal legislation was introduced to permit executions, organs from executions in 1984, and it remains on the statute book, incidentally. Transplant and execution statistics remain a state secret. In an organ donation system with matching registries and databases that I've just described did not exist in China except as a pilot scheme from 2010 onwards. There was nothing before that. In 2014, that organ donation system became official national policy. Now, as I've said, the number of executions had to be collated by external groups because China didn't tell us about the number of executions. So Amnesty or the Duihua Foundation, where these data come from, counted up the number of executions. In 2002, there were 12,000 state-supported executions in China in 1 year. External pressure, particularly the use of executed prisoners as organ donors, prompted a gradual reduction in the number of executions. And by 2013, the number had fallen to 2,400, still a large number. And this is at a time when there was no voluntary organ donation system and when Chinese officials were claiming 10,000 transplants per year being performed in China. This was recently reported in the BMC Ethics Journal. And over 1997 to 2009, they derived 120,000 transplants, that's 10,000 a year roughly. And the official number of registered donors during that time was 130 voluntary donors. Throughout the period of that graph, officials in China were quoting 10,000 transplants a year. So if you've got a tiny number of voluntary donors a falling number of executed donors. Where did the donors come from, if not from executed death row prisoners and not from voluntary donors? In 2000, at about the same time, which started in 1999, of the mass incarceration of Falun Gong, similar to the mass incarceration you're now seeing with Uyghurs, there was a huge state-supported transplant expansion of the number of hospitals and the number of staff in training and employed. Interim regulations banning the sale of organs and setting standards for the first time in transplantation were introduced in 2006. And in 2011, there was a formal declaration that organ trafficking was illegal. Now, it is impossible accurately to determine the number of transplants performed in China, for the reasons I've described. None of the official transplant registries are or were publicly accessible, and what data are provided by spokespeople for the Chinese transplant services are sparse in detail and difficult independently to corroborate. With rare exceptions, gathering data on transplant activities in China has required manual collection of data from what official sources do exist, including state-run publications, from official websites of hospitals, many of which incidentally have now been archived because they were taken down immediately there was any sign of investigation, and from clinical publications, scientific papers presented by surgeons and clinical scientists from China. Now, the China Tribunal was made aware of that information and also heard evidence and read evidence of many Chinese individuals who had spent time phoning hospitals, doctors, transplant brokers in China, pretending to be needing a transplant and asking about cost, availability, and source of donor organs. These calls, by the way, were recorded, and transcripts can be seen and some calls heard on the China Tribunal website. The calls are important because, given the lack of transparency from Chinese authorities, obtaining data was the only way of estimating numbers. By triangulating data from the individual hospitals, from transplant units, surgeons' own data, and the various publications, it proved possible for researchers to define a probable range of the number of transplants performed, and this was estimated at somewhere between 60 and 90,000, a range, so it's a probability, in 2016 in China. In that year, the number of official registered donors was 4,080. And the number of transplants reported to that registry was this number, roughly 10,000 again, a bit more. Even if we add in a highly unlikely heart and 2 lungs from each donor, that only takes us to 22,000 transplants. And even if we double that for any live transplants that might have been done, you're still way short of the derived number of transplants performed. This is a gap that can only be accounted for by an alternative large donor organ pool. And there's even significant doubt, by the way, about the numbers of registered donors and actual transplants. So in 2016, official Chinese transplants, 10,000 a year. It's Huang Jiafu, who's head of the transplant services in China. And you can see that the derived estimate was at least 60,000 transplants a year. That in itself is worrying, to say the least. But I want to consider waiting times before I finish. I've already indicated that there are more people needing organs than there are donor organs available throughout the world. Patients have to wait for an organ to become available, and sadly, some die. The average waiting time for a liver in the United Kingdom is 135 days. That includes some partial liver transplants. In China, the declared waiting time for many hospitals, particularly, for example, the Shanghai Shangzheng Hospital's website, quotes a waiting time of 1 week, 7 days. The waiting time for a deceased kidney donor in the UK is 2.5 to 3 years. I've rounded it to 950 days just to make a point. In China, the waiting time is reported in days by the people who phoned up and asked hospitals when they could come. The only way such waiting times are possible is if there is a readily available population of tissue-matched donors. How else can you have an organ available at such short notice? And it's this population at risk, this donor pool, if you like, that was the core concern of the China Tribunal. And I'll now hand back to Sir Geoffrey to wrap up.
This is perhaps hard, difficult talk to listen to because it deals with, in an unremitting way, bad things people do to other people, evil things, when circumstances collide and leaders issue orders. On top of that, you never get told the truth, and certainly no truth has emerged from China to comfort, if at all, the relations of those, principally we were concerned with Falun Gong practitioners who disappeared without trace from prisons. For me, there's another, maybe for you, another deeper unhappiness in all this. And it's this. If this evidence related to France or Belgium or the Netherlands, we'd do something about it, even if it was only to boycott their goods. But we don't. China's a long way away. And the only inference, the only proper inference, is that we don't care. And if that conclusion is right, if you don't even think of stopping buying goods made in China because you don't really care, then the horrible conclusion from that is that there is no single humanity. And the further conclusion from that is that whatever was built on the concept of a single humanity, the Human Rights Act, based on the 48 Declaration of Human Rights said to be universal, is a fiction. And we are moving towards, maybe, and seeing in this a reflection, maybe, of what Trump wants of all of us, to return to nation states where you do what you like, behind your own borders, as the tribunal found was done in this case. The summary judgment that you saw being delivered on the second slide has been reasonably successful in expanding the amount of knowledge of what's been going on in the People's Republic of China. And to give you an example, only a couple of weeks ago, Hamid Sabi, counsel to the inquiry, who's here today, had his allotted 90 seconds. That's what you're allowed in the Human Rights Council in Geneva. If you're an NGO, he had his 90 seconds, he read it out, and it went all around the world, and it has made a lot of impact. On the same day, there was a side event in the same building. Side event means held in a side room. It was about the tribunal. And at the door, there was the China delegation, or representatives of it, trying to stop the event. And we heard from mid-level diplomats in Geneva of how now that China funds the Human Rights Council, it's going to be very difficult to achieve that, which no doubt the NGO that formed our tribunal would like to happen, which is to have countries acknowledge these inconvenient truths as truths, and to take on the responsibility that comes with knowing that your neighbour state has committed crimes, because you have to act. So that to give you some indication of what's happened to the consequences or the judgment of the tribunal and its possible slowly developing effects. It's a global problem, but for those of us here, perhaps what's happened in the United Kingdom is not uninteresting. Our government has been asked in the House of Commons and House of Lords many times about the forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong in China. And they have given a progression of answers which amount to, the evidence isn't quite good enough. No, we are not quite satisfied. It's moved now to an interesting double negative. It's, what's the word? I've forgotten. It's a double negative. It's a slight inclining towards accepting the evidence. And so when we heard of this attitude, not incontrovertible, that's it. So when we heard of these approaches by the government, and when they said, oh, we have an assessment that means we can't quite trust the evidence. Of course, the tribunal asked for it. We said, gosh, you made an assessment. Please provide it. It would be really helpful to us. I don't really need to ask you, do I, whether the assessment was ever provided. On the night of the delivery of the judgment in June, there had been prepared a 10-minute film, I suppose, big item, for Newsnight, the flagship political program. Victims and witnesses and everybody else spoken to and filmed. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, for a range of reasons which I won't go into, it was pulled and will never be screened. More interesting, and this has been picked up by one or two people, there have been two really interesting programs on China. The 3-part series, China New World Order on BBC One, and Mark Mardell's program on the 70th birthday of the People's Republic of China on the World at One, a series of talks he gave. They all refer to human rights abuses in China, but none of them refers to forced organ harvesting, not even to the allegations that have been public for 17 years, let alone to the judgment. And it's hard not to think that someone is rationing the amount of bad things we are allowed to think or know about the People's Republic of China. One moment of levity, perhaps, for those of you who remember Basil Fawlty and the German visitors to the hotel and telling his staff, don't mention the war. Well, it's rather as if in that and in our own circumstance in parallel, Basil says to the staff, you can mention the war as much as you like, but don't mention the Jews. Because that's what appears to be happening to us. Why should that be? Well, in the first of those 3 programs, Jeremy Hunt, I think, gives a very good explanation, quite possibly a sincere one, where he says, when we look at what happens to the Uyghurs, that's the people suffering in a very troubling way in northwest China, this is obviously completely against our values. We raise these issues with the Chinese government when we see them, and we understand that if we talk too loudly and publicly about our human rights concerns, we'll lose access to senior people in the Chinese government. We won't be able to do any good at all. And then he says this, I think very few countries have any leverage at all when it comes to what happens inside China. And the Chinese government is absolutely clear that this is not a matter for other countries, isn't it? Is that what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights meant? Is that what is meant in the Genocide Convention? We did not find as a tribunal that genocide had been committed, but we invited people to question it. Is that what is meant in that convention to which China is signed up when it says if you know genocide's happening, you as a state have got to take action? Absolutely clear this is not a matter for outside countries. Now, in standard philosophical utilitarian terms, this may be quite a reasonable argument, but contrast it with, in your minds, I won't spell it out, a hypothetical about that unmentionable comparable of World War II. You're never allowed, really, in these sort of discussions to refer to Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. But what would we say now of the suppression of known truths from the public for some kind of geopolitical, maybe commercial interest of matters of a similar gravity to that of the Holocaust, if as I suggest, the suppression may be in the interest of, amongst other things, trade? Well, you can think that through for yourself and work it out. Just back to the tribunal for a couple of minutes, and then we'll have questions and answers. When we formed the tribunal, we tried to learn from the good things and the bad things of other tribunals, and we tried to fit this tribunal into the climate of today. So that, unlike the Russell Tribunal into Vietnam, which had 30 members, all left-leaning intellectuals, writers, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Tariq Ali, and the chairman or the leader of one left-wing British trade union, people who had a clear sympathy with a certain approach towards Vietnam, we sought to have people who had no interest and no knowledge. And apart from having to have two people with expertise to make sure we understood in our private discussions evidence coming to us, one of them being Martin and the other being a professor in Chinese studies who would avoid us falling into too many blunders through the immense cultural crossover that we might not be able otherwise to deal with. We knew nothing about these events. We didn't want to. We weren't associated with China. 5 of us, indeed, knew literally nothing of these allegations when we started. And another thing that we didn't want to do was to have just lawyers. As I say, there happened to be 4 lawyers, but they weren't working as lawyers. Many tribunals have just lawyers working as the panel. Why? We're all quite capable of dealing with certain issues, and this is one that is capable of being dealt with on evidence in the way that Martin has so clearly demonstrated as to many parts of that evidence in what he's been able to tell you. So that was our approach. And not only did we want to avoid lawyers, we probably wanted, in a way, to avoid having 2 famous people on it. I think if the NGO had managed to get a big name to chair it, they would have preferred that, and I'd have been only too happy to go along with that. But in the event, big name said no. So it became a tribunal of people, which is why I emphasized the term people right at the beginning of what I said. And so in this way, we hope, that the model of the tribunal that we've established, that led to the conclusions that we've discussed, none of which, by the way, has been challenged in any analytical or deconstruction way since delivery of our judgment. We hope that this may prove a model for other problems of this kind to be dealt with by we the people. Maybe it does reflect the age in which we live and in which, in our case, we were able to reach our judgment moment. Thank you.